Welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot, and let me tell you a story. Some letters from New York have said, if you are ever in a battle, do describe it. In this curiosity, I have myself shared, and have always longed to know not only how the scene appeared, but how the spectator felt. I am able now to answer the question, and in so doing I will try and describe to you precisely how the attack appeared to me, without entering into an account of anything but what I saw and how I felt. It was by accident that I was at Fort Donelson, and with the attacking column. My regiment left me at St. Louis attending a court-martial. The court adjourned soon afterward, and then with another member, an officer of the 14th Iowa, I started for Fort Henry. We descended the Mississippi to the narrow point where the Ohio joins it, and on which are the fortifications of Cairo. At Cairo, there were no boats save those of the government conveying troops, and on one of these we went. It was the McGill, and on board was the regiment which was to lead the assault at Fort Donelson, the 2nd Iowa. Upon the time of starting, we supposed that the destination of the boat was Fort Henry on the Tennessee. It was then announced Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. We glided slowly up the Ohio against its swollen current and passed the mouth of the Tennessee during the night. I arose with the first gleam of light and went on deck to find that we had entered the Cumberland. It seemed a narrow river, winding amid wooded hills and banks covered with noble oaks. The soldiers, who had passed a warm moonlit night on deck, were rising one by one, folding blankets and packing knapsacks. I turned from them to the river and looked curiously for the people who dwelt in this rebel part of Kentucky. For a short time, there was nothing but woods. Then a little log house appeared upon the bank. A shed was beside it with its single horse and cow. It was a humble home, and hardly worth a second glance. 100 such might be seen on the banks of any river. But in front of the door stood a sturdy little flagstaff, and from it waved the stars and stripes. The family had risen at the sound of the steamer, and the mother stood in the doorway, holding an infant and waving an apron. A little girl nearby timidly tossed her hood around her head, and 2 ragged boys at the water's edge swung their caps joyfully. The father stood on a stump, hurrahing alone but lustily, and over them, in the dim gray light, fluttered their little flag. Oh, they mean it. They're honest. There's no make-believe there, were the exclamations of the soldiers as they crowded to the side of the boat and answered the father and his boys with their louder cheers. This was the first house we saw, and the warmest welcome we received, for though many hats were waved to us during the day, and a few flags shone, none equaled in their manifest sincerity the inmates of that little log house. Well, the day was soft and beautiful, and we passed it upon the upper deck, laughing and chatting and watching the shifting scenery of the winding river. A pleasure excursion it seemed to all, and again someone would remark, "We may be on the brink of battle, yet it seems as though we're traveling for pleasure." Among the rough exteriors which campaigning gives, 2 officers of the 2nd were remarkable for their neat appearance. Some jokes were made at their expense, calling them the dandies of the regiment and their staterooms the band boxes. It was agreed that they were too handsome to be spoiled by scars. 2 days afterwards, one of these, Captain Slaymaker, fell at the head of his company, heroically charging the rebel works. A little later, as I was galloping for the surgeons. I passed a wounded officer, borne by 4 soldiers in a blanket. As I rode by, he called out, "We've carried the day, Captain." I looked around and saw it was the other man, Major Chipman. "Are you badly hurt, Major?" I asked, pulling up my horse. "No, not badly," he answered. "Don't stop for me." And when the surgeon arrived, he refused to have his wounds dressed and sent him on to his men. In the afternoon, we overtook 20 steamboats laden with troops and led by 4 black gunboats. They moved slowly and kept together as if they feared approaching danger. Then came a change of weather, and night closed in upon us, dark and dreary with cold and snow. When the next morning broke, I found we had made fast to the western shore. On either bank were high and wooded hills. The gunboats lay anchored in the middle of the stream, all signs of life beneath their decks, save the white steam that slowly issued from their pipes and floated gracefully away. Far down the river we could see the troop-laden transports moored to the trees along the bank. The sky was clear and bright. The forest sparkled as snow, and the warm waters of the river smoked in the frosty air. Such a picture I have never seen, and never shall see again. Well, as the troops began to debark, the band of the 2nd Iowa came out on the upper deck, and the dear Star-Spangled Banner echoed along the river. The men beat time and hurrahed as the notes died away. The place of landing was about 3 miles below Fort Donelson. I may here say that the fort itself is about half as large as the battery, but that it is only a corner of a larger square of earthwork stretching some 2 miles to each side. To avoid the cannon on the works, it was necessary for us to make a circle of several miles, and the country was woods, and high hills, and deep ravines. A glen that we entered after leaving the river bore a strange resemblance to that on my father's farm. As I looked around, I could almost believe it was the same, through which, on such bright winter mornings, I had driven the wood sleigh or wandered with my gun. But the troops were marching, and I had no time to grow homesick. We passed, in the course of our march, a little log house. I went up to the door and spoke to the people. They seemed sad and dispirited. There had been fighting between the pickets a day or 2 before, and a shower of balls had pattered around the house. The woman said she wished she were 40 miles away, and the man, well, he said he would not care if he were 100. A little girl was near the door, and I asked her what her name was, to which she replied after a good deal of embarrassment, "Nancy Ann." Well, I let Nancy Ann look through my spyglass, and as she had never seen or even heard of one before, she was very much astonished. Nancy Ann's mother thereupon became quite hospitable and invited me to come in and rest, but the column was well nigh over the hill, and, well, I had to push on. At last we reached the position assigned to us, and here we found the 14th Iowa, to which my friend belonged, and with it I determined to remain until I could find my own regiment. Around us were thick woods and a deep glen that ran in front, and beyond this, along the brow of the opposite hill, ran those earthworks of the rebels which we were to win. It was less than half a mile across, and occasionally a rifle ball fell near us, but the distance was too great for them to be effective. I looked through the trees and examined the hill with my glass, but could see nothing save the ridge of fresh-turned earth. Along the side of the hill were our sharpshooters watching the works. I could see them crawling up behind trees and stumps, and sometimes dragging themselves along the ground, sometimes on their hands and knees. Their shots were frequent, and and it sounded as though a sporting party were below us. It was hard to believe that they were shooting at men. Oh, it was wonderful how soon the mind accustomed itself to these strange circumstances. And after the first half hour, we took no more notice of the rifle shots than though some boys were at play. Behind those earthworks were cannon as well as men. We were completely within range, and they could have sent their shot and shell amongst us at any time. The night before, no fires had been allowed, as they would indicate our position to the rebels. But they were now burning, and around one of them, 3 or 4 of us gathered to dine. As we sat down upon a log, we heard distant sounds of cannon along the river. There go the gunboats. The fight has begun. They're shelling the rascals out, said everybody. We had taken for granted all that time, and indeed upon to the last minute, that the gunboats would dismantle the fort, and that all we should have to do would be to prevent the escape of the rebels. In this thought, we were much mistaken. Well, the cannonade lasted an hour and then stopped. We hoped the fort was taken, but no such news came to gladden us. In watching the earthworks, in talking and warming ourselves at the campfires, the afternoon wore away. Evening came, and it was determined to risk the fires. So again we sat down beside one for supper. It consisted of hard-boiled bread, raw pork, and coffee. The coffee you probably would not recognize in New York, boiled in an open kettle and about the color of a brownstone front. It was, nevertheless, our greatest comfort, and the only warm thing we had. The pork was frozen, and the water in the canteens solid ice, so that we had to hold them over the fire when we wanted a drink. No one had plates, spoons, forks, or saucers. We cut off the frozen pork with our pocket knives, and one tin cup, from which each took a drink in turn, served the coffee. It grew darker. The campfires burned brightly, and no threatening shot or shell had come from the fort. Our sharpshooters and sentinels were between us and the rebels, and it was determined that we might sleep. The men stacked their arms and wrapped themselves in their blankets around the fires. This was my first night out. Hitherto my quarters had been in houses. I had not even passed a night in a tent. And a life among the comforts of New York is not a good preparative for the field. And I had looked forward to a tent at this season with some little anxiety, but I was now to begin without even that shelter. My waterproof blanket and buffalo skin were also on board the steamer, so that I had to trust to the better fortune of my friends for these. We managed to find 4 blankets. 2 of them were wet and frozen, and a buffalo skin. The snow was scraped away from the windward side of the fire, and the 2 frozen blankets were laid on the ground. A log was rolled up for a windbreak, and the buffalo spread over the blankets. On this, 4 of us were stretched, and very close and straight we had to lie. It fared ill with the trappings of military life. Handsome great coats were ignominiously rolled up like horse blankets, and my beautiful saber, the gift of Northmore Street friends, ordinarily stained by no speck of rust or drop of rain, was tossed out into the snow with pistols and spyglasses, with the same gentle treatment. For a few minutes I kept awake. The rebels were but 15 minutes' distance, and if they chose to make a night attack, their shells might burst amongst us at any moment. The snowflakes began to fall faster and faster, and I slipped my head under the blanket and fell asleep. I can imagine that you will say we were to be pitied, but never did I ever sleep more sweetly. Soon after midnight, the sound of cannon roused us. The snow was 3 inches deep upon our blankets, yet we were comfortable, and surprised to find it lying there. The ground, however, had thawed beneath us, and when we rose, the snow crept in among our blankets and wet them, so Lying down was out of the question. We bent down a couple of saplings and spread blankets over them, making a little shed. Under this we crept, and after piling plenty of wood upon our fire, the soldier's invariable comfort, his pipe, was at hand, and thus we chatted and smoked and dozed till daylight. The sun of Saturday rose bright and clear, and more than one asked if it were an omen for us or for the foe. Well, the morning passed as the day before, but about noon word came up from far below that down on our right the rebels had attempted to cut their way out. They were driven back, but the fight was bloody and, well, it was said that we had lost 500 men. We were warned to be watchful, as though they might be reattempting it near us. I said we were in front of a large glen or ravine, and on our right were numerous regiments making a chain which stretched to the river. On our left was the 2nd Iowa. This was all that I had seen of our position, and consequently is all that I shall describe now, inasmuch as I am giving it to you precisely as it appeared to me. Soon a mounted orderly rode by who told us that a large body of rebels were moving up on our opposite side. Our men were called together and stood near their stacked arms. A little while, and General Smith and his staff came up. They passed by in front of us, but said nothing. At the same time, the sharpshooters along the glen were unusually active, and there were repeated shots by them. We thought they saw the rebels mustering behind the breastworks. Everything seemed to indicate a sally from the rebels, and that we were to drive them back as they had been driven back in the morning. The men took up their arms. Officers loosened their pistol holsters. I took up my cavalry saber, unbuttoned my great coat so that I could quickly throw it off, and took my place beside the lieutenant colonel with whom I was to act. Then there came a painful, unpleasant pause. We heard nothing. We saw nothing, yet knew that something was coming. What that something was, no one could tell. A messenger came from the general, and we were to move to the left and support the 2nd Iowa. We supposed the rebels were crossing a little higher up, and that the gap between us and the 2nd was to be closed. The colonel gave the order, "Left face, forward march," and the regiment passed along through the thickest trees in a column of 2 abreast. But the 2nd were not where they had been in the morning. We marched on, but did not come to them. In a few moments we passed their campfires. A few more moments, and we emerged onto an open field. At a glance, the real object of the movement was apparent. It came upon us in an instant, like the lifting of a curtain. The 14th were hurrying up through the field, and the 2nd, in a long line, were struggling up the opposite hill, where 2 glens met and formed a ridge. It was high and steep, slippery with mud and melted snow. And then at the top, the breastworks of the rebels flashed and smoked, while to the right and left up either glen, cannon were thundering. The attempt seemed desperate, and down through the field we went and began to climb the hill. At the very foot I found we were in the line of fire. Rifle balls hissed over us, and bleeding men lay all upon the ground or were dragging themselves down the hill. From the foot to the breastworks, the 2nd Iowa left a long line of dead and wounded upon the ground. The sight of these was the most appalling part of the scene, and for a moment completely diverted my attention from the firing. A third of the way up, we came under fire from the batteries. The shot, and more especially the shell, came with the rushing, a clashing of a locomotive on a railroad. You could hear the boom of the cannon up the ravine, and then the sound of the shell, and then felt it rushing at you. top of the hill, the firearms sounded like bundles of immense powder crackers. They would go rap, rap, and then they would scatter, and other scattered shots would be rap, rap, and some more fired together, rap, rap, in a long succession. This resemblance was so striking that it impressed me at the moment. The bursting of the shell produced much less effect, apparent effect, I mean, than I anticipated. Their explosion, too, was much like a large powder cracker thrown in the air. There was a loud bang, and fragments flew all about, and all was over. It was so quickly done that you had no time to anticipate or to think. You were either killed or you were safe, and it was all over. But the most dispiriting thing was that we saw no enemy. The batteries were out of sight, and at the breastworks, nothing could be seen but fire and smoke. It seemed as though we were attacking some invisible power, and that it was a simple question of time whether we could climb that slippery steep before we were all shot or not. But suddenly, the firing at the summit ceased. The 2nd Iowa had charged the works and driven out the regiment which had held them. Then came the fire of the 2nd line upon our flying foes, and then loud shouts upon the line of, "Hurrah, hurrah, the 2nd are in, hurry up, boys, close up, forward." We reached the top and scrambled over the breastworks. I saw a 2nd hill rising gradually before us, and on the top of it a 2nd breastwork. Between us and it was only about 400 yards of broken ground. A 2nd fire opened upon us from these inner works, and we were ordered back, and recrossing those we had taken, laid down upon the outer side of the embankment. The breastwork that had sheltered the enemy now sheltered us. It was about 6 feet high on our side, and the men lay close against it. And occasionally a hat was pushed up above it, and then a rifle ball would come whistling over us from the 2nd entrenchment, and the batteries also continued to fire, but the shot passed lower down the hill and did little execution. Having no specific duty to discharge, I turned as soon as our troops reached the breastworks and gave my aid to the wounded. A singular fact for which I could not account was that those near the foot of the hill were struck in the legs. Higher up the hill, the shots had gone through the body, and near the breastworks, through their head. Indeed, at the top of the hill I noticed no wounded. All who lay upon the ground there were dead. A little house in the field was used as a hospital, and I tore my handkerchief into strips and tied them around the wounds which were bleeding badly, and made the men hold snow upon them. I then took a poor fellow in my arms to carry to the little house. "Throw down your gun," I said. "You're too weak to carry it." No, he replied. "I will hold on to it as long as I'm alive." The house happened to be in the exact line of one of the batteries, and as we approached it, a shot flew over our path, and fortunately the house was below the range, but one came so low as to knock off a shingle from the gable end. For a few minutes we thought they were firing on the wounded. We had no red flag to display, but I found a man with a red handkerchief and tied it to a stick and sent him to the roof with it. Within the house there were but 3 surgeons at this time. One of them asked me to take his horse and ride for the instruments and ambulances and assistants, for no preparations had been made. It was then I passed Major Chipman carried by his soldiers. When I returned, the ambulances were busy at their work. Numerous couples of soldiers were supporting wounded friends, and occasionally came 4, one in a blanket. The wounded men generally showed the greatest heroism. They hardly ever alluded to themselves, but shouted to the artillery that we meant to hurry forward, and told stragglers that we had carried the day. One poor boy, carried in the arms of 2 soldiers, had his foot knocked off by a shell. It dangled horribly from his limb by a piece of skin, and the bleeding stump was uncovered. I stopped to tell the men to tie a stocking around the limb and to put snow upon the wound. "Never mind the foot, Captain," he said. "We drove the rebels out, and we've got their trench, and that's the most I care about." Yet I confess the sights and sounds were not as distressing as I had anticipated. The small round bullet holes, though they might be mortal, looked no larger than a surgeon's lancet might have made. Only once did I hear a distressing groan. A poor wretch in an ambulance shrieked whenever the wheels struck a stump, but there was no help for it. The road was through the wood, and the driver could only avoid the trees and drive on regardless of his agony. You will perhaps ask how I felt in the fight. There was nothing upon which I had had so much curiosity as to what my feelings would be. Much to my surprise, I found myself unpleasantly cool. I did not get excited, and I felt a great want of something to do. I thought that if I only had something, my own company to lead on or somebody to order, I should have much less to think about. There seemed to be such a certainty of being hit that I felt certain I should be, and after a few minutes had a vague sort of wish that it would come if it were coming and just be over with. The alarming effect of the bullets and shell was less than I supposed it would be, and my strongest sensation of danger was produced by the sight of the dead and wounded. The thing I was most afraid of was a panic among our men, and when the 7th Illinois was ordered to fall back down the hill, I so much feared that the men might deem it as a retreat that I entirely forgot about the firing and walked down in front of them, talking to their major so that any frightened man in the ranks might be reassured by our matter-of-course air. Take it all together, I think I felt and acted pretty much as I do in any unusual and exciting affair. I know I found myself looking for an illustration of the effects of the shells and wondering if there was no greater and grander illustration of the musketry than a bunch of powder crackers. I remember that I did little things from habit as usual. When I threw off my overcoat, for example, I took a pipe which a friend had given me from the pocket, lest it should be lost. And I remembered that I once corrected my grammar when I inadvertently adopted the Western style of telling the men to lay down, and as I did so, I thought that 1 or 2 people at North Moore Street would have been very apt to laugh if they heard it. Yet for all this, I was by no means unconscious of danger. Some officers seemed utterly indifferent to it. Thus, in the fight of Thursday, Colonel Shaw of the 14th, after ordering his men to lie down, not only remained on his horseback, but crossed his leg over the pommel of the saddle, sitting sideways to be more comfortable. The sharpshooters of the enemy concentrated their fire on him, he being the only person visible, and as the bullets thickened about him, the colonel said indignantly, "Why, those rascals are firing at me. I shall have to move." And he threw his leg back and walked his horse down the other side of the line. Our men lay in the trench all night, exposed to the western wind, which blew keenly around the summit of the hill. A large force of the enemy within a few yards, able to rush upon them at any moment. I had gone back just after dark with the adjutant, who had been hurt by the explosion of a shell, and my return with him saved me. When morning came, we went back. As we reached the foot of the hill, we were told that a white flag had been displayed, and an officer had gone into the fort, but that the time was nearly up and the attack was now to be renewed. We hurried on, expecting in a few moments to be in a second assault. We had nearly reached the trenches when the men sprang from the ditch to the top of the breastwork, waving the colors and giving wild hurrahs. The fort had surrendered. There was a load lifted off my mind, and I stopped to look around. The first glance fell on the blue coats scattered through the felled trees and stumps. The march of our troops up the hill had been somewhat in the form of a broom. Until near the top, they had been in column, leaving a long, narrow line like the handle, and as they rushed at the breastworks, they had spread out like the broom. This ground was plainly marked by the dead. Now that my attention was given, I was surprised to find how many were strewn upon the narrow strip. Here was one close to me. About the width of a classroom beyond was another. A little further on, two had fallen, side by side. In a little triangle, I counted 18 bodies, and many I knew had been carried off during the night. Still, the scene was not so painful as the dead room of the hospital at St. Louis. The attitudes were peaceful, the arms in all but one case thrown naturally over the breast, as in sleep, and no face gave any indication of a painful death. Well, I passed on and entered the breastwork. It was about the height of a man. On top was a large log, and between the log and the earthwork a narrow slit. Through this they had fired on us. The log had hidden their heads so that while we were in plain view, they were to us as an invisible foe. Immediately within were 6 more bodies of the 2nd Iowa, and one in simple homespun. He was the only one of the enemy upon the ground. The soldiers gathering around him looked as I did myself, with some curiosity upon one who had thus met the punishment of his treason. He had been shot through the back of his head while running, and his face expressed only wonderment and fright, and showed him a country-bred youth, illiterate, uncultivated, a contrast to the still intelligent faces that lay around him. Meanwhile, our troops were forming along the hill to take possession of the fort. All voices declared the 2nd Iowa should lead. As it moved past the other regiments to the head of the column, the men cheered them, and the officers uncovered, but they seemed sad and wearied. I looked along their line and found of the officers I knew, hardly one was there. It was a beautiful sight to see regiment after regiment mount the 2nd breastwork and watch them successfully halt and cheer and wave their colors as they crossed. I pushed on, scrambled over it, and found myself in the midst of 500 of the prisoner. They were strange figures in white blanket or carpet coats, having the same unintelligent faces as the one who had been killed outside. I stared at them, and they at me. They looked crestfallen and confused, but showed little feeling, and during the day I saw but few faces of common soldiers that awakened any pity. They, poor fellows, sat sadly looking at the scene. To one of them I spoke. He said he'd done nothing to bring on the war. He'd been for the Union, and had only enlisted a month before to avoid being impressed. His family lived, or had lived, he didn't know where they were now, within a mile, and he would give a great deal to see them for only a minute. "Will your officers let me write to tell them that I'm alive?" "Oh, to be sure they will." "And will be furnished with food?" "Oh, yes, the same as our soldiers." "Most of our men expected if we surrendered unconditionally that you would kill us." "Well, you can see we've not done so." "No. They have treated us very kindly, and we have been deceived." Such was the tenor of our conversation. I may say here that our men behaved admirably, and I did not hear of a single indignity being offered to any of our prisoners. A few sentinels were placed around a regiment of prisoners, and so, for as far as appearances went, half of them might have escaped. But the woods around the fort contained regiments of our troops, and they knew the attempt would be hopeless. We were assigned the quarters of the 15th Tennessee, and I slept in what had been the colonel's room. It was a nice little house of oak blocks, laid up so that the wood and bark alternated, giving a very pretty tessellated appearance. It had all sorts of comforts which we had never even hoped for at Camp Benton, and while we supposed that they had been roughing it, we found that we had been roughing it ourselves. We invited the colonel and some of his officers to spend the night with us. I confess they behaved with dignity. They made no complaints and submitted with quiet resignation to their changed circumstances. But they were Tennesseans, and though they made no professions in words, convinced us that they had been Union men at heart and wished the Union back again. One of us remarked that if those who had been released heretofore had not abused it and violated their pledge and oath, the prisoners at Fort Donelson would probably be released in the same way. The lieutenant colonel said he wished it could be so. He was confident none of his men would thus be guilty. But he added, "I don't blame the government for sending us north. I acknowledge that I am a rebel taken in arms, and it is fully justified in treating me accordingly." It was a novelty indeed, thus spending the evening with our late opponents. We made no allusions that could hurt their feelings, but talked over the events of the siege until a late hour. They told us the surrender was a thunderclap to all. The men and most of the officers had not seen how completely they were surrounded, and had been made to believe that they were successful. The evening before they were told this, and in the morning it was announced that their generals had run away, and they were prisoners of war. I now began to look about me and feel a little of the confusion that follows a battle. My trunk had been left on the steamer, and the steamer had moved. My blankets had been left in a hospital tent, and the hospital tent had disappeared. My regiment was 14 miles off at Fort Henry. The biscuits and coffee on which we had lived were gone, and provisions had not followed us into the fort. I procured a captured horse, and the next morning started at daylight for Fort Henry. As I passed a regiment in the woods, the commissary was dealing out a biscuit and a handful of sugar to each man for breakfast. He good-naturedly said he would give me my share. After a long ride, I found my men camped in some woods, all well and bitterly disappointed at not having been at Fort Donelson. If you like these stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.